memprovokasi kami tentang apa peran pemerintah. Kami belum pernah duduk dan mengartikulasikannya. Jadi ini peluang yang baik di diskusi panel ini untuk mendengar pandangan orang lain. Di satu sisi itu hampir tidak bisa didefinisikan karena peran pemerintah itu sangat luas. Pemerintah di Inggris untuk kebijakan internet, saya sadar di setiap tingkatan kebijakan internet mempengaruhi semua menteri di apakah kesehatan, keamanan, kebijakan luar negeri dan lain-lain. Jadi selalu ada risiko untuk itu. Tapi apabila Anda melihat di mana peran pemerintah, kami ada 4 tema yang saya harap akan membentuk diskusi ini, mengarahkan diskusi ini. Yang pertama adalah untuk membangun infrastruktur, mendukung pembangunan infrastruktur di Inggris. Kami beruntung ada pasar telekom yang kompetitif, jadi pasarnya dibangun oleh sektor swasta dan juga ada fiber optik oleh Virgin dan operator telepon seluler membangun jaringan 4G. Infrastruktur tersebut juga dapat diakses oleh semua konsumen karena harganya rendah dan pelayanan yang diterima itu sangat canggih. Tapi pemerintah telah mengintervensi secara langsung untuk membangun jaringan untuk daerah pedesaan. Kami memberi miliaran pound untuk membangun infrastruktur, meskipun mayoritas dari infrastruktur itu dibayar oleh sektor swasta. Saya ingin tekankan bahwa pemerintah ada di belakang itu dengan menyediakan kerangka kerja regulasi untuk memastikan kompetisi dan harga yang wajar. Dan yang kedua, pemerintah mempunyai peran untuk memastikan bahwa kerangka kerja hukum domestik itu konsisten. Banyak klise di internet. Satu adalah apa yang tidak legal online itu juga tidak legal offline. Apabila sebuah suatu kegiatan berlangsung di internet tidak legal, pemerintah bisa mengupdate kerangka kerja legal khususnya berkaitan dengan internet. Contohnya tentang tanda tangan elektronik adalah contoh yang baik. Kami juga mengintervensi tentang isu tertentu di mana internet telah memperburuk sebuah isu. Jadi contohnya pelanggaran hak haki. Kami membuat legislasi untuk memperingatkan orang apabila mereka melanggar haki. Jadi kita bekerja sama dengan lembaga pengawas internet dan bekerja dengan penyedia jasa internet untuk memberikan perlindungan bagi orang tua untuk anak-anaknya, dan juga dengan masyarakat madani. Kami pikir itu cara yang terbaik. Legislasi dari atas ke bawah itu penting apabila Anda ingin hasil yang efektif. Itu penting untuk bekerja dalam kemitraan. Saya juga ingin menekankan prinsip utama intervensi pemerintah tidak sama dengan kontrol pemerintah. Pemerintah bisa bertindak sebagai perantara dan bisa mengintervensi isu yang merupakan isu yang besar, tapi tidak sama dengan mengontrol internet. Dan saya pikir itu menuju ke poin ketiga saya, bahwa Inggris adalah advokat yang kuat untuk kebebasan berekspresi. Jadi penting bagi pemerintah untuk memainkan peran untuk membela kebebasan berekspresi di internet untuk kesetaraan gender dan membantu setiap warga negara untuk menggunakan internet dengan memberikan kesempatan untuk pendidikan dan keterampilan yang dibutuhkan untuk mendapatkan akses internet. Internet adalah kekuatan besar yang baik, tapi juga ada bahayanya. Dan pemerintah menemukan di Inggris itu sangat efektif untuk bekerja sama dengan masyarakat madani, khususnya dengan anak-anak di sekolah, untuk memberi peluang bagi mereka untuk bertanya dan belajar dengan efektif untuk menggunakan internet secara aman. Dan itu adalah peran yang penting bagi pemerintah. Dan akhirnya, prinsip keempat adalah di mana pemerintah bisa membantu untuk mendukung proses kemitraan multi-stakeholder. Itu adalah dasar dari keberhasilan internet dalam dekade terakhir. Kami melakukan itu dengan menulis cek, dengan memberikan dukungan finansial untuk kelompok utama, dan juga untuk mendukung proses IGF. Kami adalah yang pertama untuk membentuk IGF domestik, dan dengan memastikan bahwa kehadiran kami dirasakan melalui event-event penting seperti ini. Jadi, Ketua, apabila saya bisa meringkas, pemerintah sudah tentu punya peran, tapi saya harap saya telah menunjukkan bahwa peran pemerintah berperan sebagai mitra, bukan seseorang yang mendikte bagaimana internet berkembang. Jadi kami bermitra dengan sektor swasta untuk membangun infrastruktur, dan kami menyediakan dana dan memberikan kerangka kerja regulasi untuk memastikan bahwa infrastruktur kompetitif supaya konsumen bisa mendapat manfaat. Kami bermitra dengan sektor swasta dan masyarakat madani untuk isu utama seperti pelanggaran haki, perlindungan anak-anak online, internet, dan memerangi gambar-gambar pornografi anak, dan juga mendukung kebebasan berekspresi di internet. Kami mendukung kerangka kerja multi-stakeholder yang kami pikir penting untuk kelangsungan keberlanjutan internet. Terima kasih. Terima kasih Pak Menteri. Sekarang sebelum saya ke Duta Besar dari Telkom Policy Forum di bulan Mei, ada satu draft opini yang setara dengan resolusi, merupakan hasil dari WTPF yang diajukan berhasil dari peran pemerintah. Draft pertama adalah mengkritisi atau banyak usulan perubahan, tapi delegasi Brasil dalam satu malam membuat revisi draft, dan itu waktu itu akan disetujui, tapi waktu itu kehabisan waktu, dan Sekretaris Jenderal dari ITU mengatakan bahwa opini tersebut akan diambil, dan mereka secara tegas menyebutkan rapat ini, IGF, untuk memfinalisasi program, dan kami membawanya ke IGF, dan akan Pak Duta Besar dipersilakan. Terima kasih Ketua, terima kasih atas pengantarnya. Anda sudah menunjukkan fakta bahwa draft opini yang muncul dari WTPF itu adalah hasil dari konsultasi ekstensif yang dilakukan dengan berbagai pihak, pemerintah maupun perwakilan stakeholder lain yang menghadiri pertemuan tersebut. Dan dengan melakukan itu, kami mencoba berfokus pada ide inti yang ingin kami sampaikan melalui draft opini tersebut. Dan ide utamanya adalah sebagai pengakuan peran dan tanggung jawab yang dimiliki pemerintah dalam remote stakeholder model stakeholder jarak jauh. Kita harus menyarankan cara di mana peran tersebut akan dioperasionalisasikan sepenuhnya. Kami tidak ingin memperluas peran pemerintah dengan merugikan stakeholder lain, kami mengakui fakta bahwa ada tanggung jawab yang berbeda dan kami mencoba untuk membuat cara yang dapat ditingkatkan, dan ini adalah realisasi dalam konteks diskusi tata kelola internet dari perwakilan negara berkembang. Ada representasi yang cukup bukan hanya dari pemerintah tapi juga dari stakeholder lain dari negara berkembang, khususnya dari negara kurang berkembang. Jadi ini adalah upaya hasil untuk mengoperasionalisasikan peran pemerintah. Jadi kami meninjau ITU dan organisasi lain mempunyai legitimasi dalam proses, dan kita harus mendukung partisipasi pemerintah yang berarti. Jadi ini juga pengakuan untuk legitimasi partisipasi ITU dan lembaga lain dalam proses ini. Markus Kumus mengacu di pertemuan di WIC di Dubai dan memberikan hasil yang berhasil mencoba untuk memerankan peran pendekatan sebagai fasilitator dalam proses, karena kami berbagi karakteristik yang memungkinkan kami untuk berbicara dengan konstituen yang berbeda. Jadi dengan ini kan kita bisa mediasi, dan pada akhirnya outcome-nya bukan yang kami cari, tapi kami kagum bahwa ITU harus ada peran dalam tata kelola internet, itu mengangkat penolakan, dan jadi sebagian konsensus yang muncul dari agenda itu harus ditegaskan kembali, legitimasi dari pemerintah, karena penolakan yang sama juga berlaku bagi pemerintah pada awal proposal, dan kami mengakui bahwa pemerintah harus membantu untuk partisipasi yang berarti, dan pada saat yang sama kami menekankan internet harus melibatkan semua pihak dan sesuai tanggung jawab mereka, dan harus bekerja sama dengan etikat baik. Dan bagian dari opini mengundang Sekretaris Jenderal untuk mendukung pengembangan kapasitas di negara berkembang, khususnya di negara kurang berkembang, untuk melaksanakan hak mereka dan memenuhi tanggung jawab mereka untuk isu kebijakan publik sesuai paragraf 5A dari agenda Tunisia, dan mendukung transparansi dalam ITU. Ini yang ingin saya tunjukkan untuk Brazil, di mana tata kelola internet harus transparan dan terbuka, dan ini poin yang kami buat dalam konteks ITU. Saya pikir ini adalah ide yang paling penting. Ya, saya pikir ini adalah dokumen hidup. Dokumen ini berevolusi tergantung sesuai dengan perbaikan terus-menerus. Waktu saya menyebutkan bahwa ITU harus mendukung pengembangan kapasitas, waktu kami mendukung diskusi tentang kebijakan publik tentang internet, kami juga harus mempunyai pemahaman bahwa ini semuanya di ITU bermandat untuk beroperasi seperti rencana aksi Jenewa. Saya pikir ITU, HK, semuanya di luar cakupan ITU. Jadi diskusi ini di milik forum lain di mana tata kelola internet. Apakah hasil yang diharapkan? Kami setuju sepenuhnya bahwa ini adalah peran utama yang dimainkan pemerintah, peran fasilitasi untuk menyediakan kerangka kerja dan regulasi hukum yang sesuai untuk mempromosikan kebebasan berekspresi. Kami setuju sepenuhnya, dan ini mungkin cara yang berbeda untuk menyampaikan ide kami melalui draft opini kami. Dan saya pikir saya harus berhenti di sini. Terima kasih. Dan poin terakhir untuk mengindikasikan bahwa salah satu pertanyaan kebijakan yang diangkat dalam persiapan rapat ini mengacu pada fakta bagaimana partisipasi pemerintah berkaitan dengan badan regulasi seperti ITF dan yang lain. Itu poin yang penting apabila kita bisa melihat cara untuk mengoperasionalisasikan cara partisipasi pemerintah untuk mempertimbangkan lembaga regulasi. Jadi partisipasi pemerintah bukan yang diperlukan, tapi pemerintah harus dilibatkan dalam proses tersebut. Jadi pertanyaan tersebut ditanyakan. Jadi banyak peran pemerintah untuk meregulasi internet melalui ITU, melalui badan regulasi. Mungkin pemerintah tidak tahu. Pertanyaan yang penting, bagaimana pemerintah bisa diintegrasikan dalam badan regulasi internet supaya pendapat mereka bisa didengarkan dan dimitigasi tanpa menghambat kebebasan informasi. Siapa yang harus dilibatkan? Jadi ini satu elemen yang harus ada dalam gambar, dengan kita mencari cara di mana pemerintah dari bagian stakeholder dapat membuat peran dan tanggung jawab mereka dilaksanakan dan mempertimbangkan fakta-fakta sepenuhnya. Badan regulasi melakukan tugas-tugas yang penting, harus diakui oleh pemerintah dan diintegrasikan sepenuhnya dalam proses, bukan untuk bersaing dengan atau tumpang tindih dengan sesuatu yang sudah dilakukan oleh badan regulasi sendiri. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih banyak yang Mulia Duta Besar. Jadi peran komunitas madani yang sudah diberikan di IGF sudah membangun jembatan seperti yang kita lihat di Dubai. Dan pertanyaan mengenai kebijakan yang seperti disampaikan oleh Yang Mulia Duta Besar, Anda bisa lihat di layar dan juga Anda bisa unduh dari website. Tapi saya setuju bahwa pertanyaan nomor 4 adalah pertanyaan yang sangat penting. Nah, sebelum saya memberikan kepada Duta Besar Sepulveda, saya sampaikan di awal bahwa ini sudah di-tweet di Twitter dan terima kasih atas kesempatannya. Saya juga ingin mengucapkan terima kasih kepada semua peserta yang ada di sini dan juga komentar Pak Menteri dan juga Duta Besar, dan saya juga mengucapkan terima kasih atas keikutsertaan dari masyarakat madani dan juga komunitas teknis, dan saya menyambut baik adanya dialog dua arah dengan semua yang ada di ruangan ini. Saya sebetulnya hadir di WTPF dan saya paham dengan proposal Brazil dan juga diskusi yang dilakukan di sana dan juga diskusi yang dilakukan setelahnya. Dan saya ingin melihat ke belakang sedikit. Dan memang dipahami bahwa pemerintah memiliki kepentingan untuk terlibat dalam diskusi ini karena internet, network, koneksi antar jaringan ini diinisiasi sebagai suatu eksperimen privat semenjak 30 tahun yang lalu, tapi sekarang ini menjadi bagian yang sangat penting dari pertumbuhan dan pembangunan ekonomi. Jadi secara wajar tentu saja setiap pemerintah manapun akan ingin mengatur mereka yang bisa mengakses alat yang canggih ini dan sudah dikelola di bawah sistem multi-stakeholder atau pemangku kepentingan beragam yang setelah melalui beberapa proses perbaikan, dan saya tidak ingin menjelaskan lebih lanjut tentang proposal di Brazil atau diskusi tertentu, tapi dari berbagai proposal dan juga diskusi yang sudah dilakukan, dan ini sudah seperti kita lihat, sistem multi-stakeholder yang tadinya komunitasnya kecil sekali, dari komunitas teknis yang kecil dan komunitas akademis yang kecil, dan juga dari sisi peneliti dari perwakilan pemerintah, tapi sekarang sudah berubah menjadi komunitas yang lebih besar dengan sistem yang lebih canggih, lebih maju, dan melibatkan kedua lembaga tersebut. Dan kita selalu ingin melibatkan transparansi sistem ini untuk memastikan bahwa ini bisa memenuhi kebutuhan pengguna internet dan juga kebutuhan pemerintah, dan bisa beradaptasi dengan dunia yang sangat dinamis ini, dunia di tempat di mana kita tinggal. Selama beberapa tahun ada berbagai macam proposal untuk membentuk satu badan intergovernmental untuk menjadi satu pusat untuk pembuatan kebijakan, penyusunan pengambilan keputusan, penyusunan kebijakan, dan Amerika Serikat menghargai ide ini, dan juga lembaga-lembaga seperti ITU, dan ini merefleksikan aspirasi yang sama untuk memastikan bahwa sistem multi-stakeholder ini memastikan pelibatan semua stakeholder, pemangku kepentingan, dan semua pemangku kepentingan diperlakukan yang secara sama. Tapi proposal yang kita lihat sekarang ini sebetulnya mengesampingkan proposal yang sudah dibahas di Brazil, dan menurut kami sering menimbulkan suatu tantangan atau masalah, yaitu hanya akan meningkatkan akses global yang sedikit sekali, akses global internet yang sedikit sekali, dan bahkan tidak akan menjangkau tujuannya kalau diimplementasikan secara tidak benar. Jadi sistem multi-stakeholder ini terbukti lebih sukses dibandingkan dengan model-model lainnya untuk deployment dan juga tata kelola teknologi baru. Dan bukan ingin mengatakan bahwa sistem ini sempurna, tapi setelah ada perbaikan sejak peluncurannya, maka telah banyak perbaikan di GAC di Brazil, dan di GAC di mana Brazil ada anggotanya dan juga negara-negara lain adalah anggota aktifnya. Sistem multi-stakeholder ini membuktikan bahwa masyarakat madani sudah menunjukkan perbaikan yang tengah berlangsung dan juga semakin meningkat. Dan ketika kita semakin berdiskusi mengarah hal itu, adanya perbaikan dari sistem ini tidak harus berfokus atau tidak boleh berfokus pada satu lembaga saja atau hanya kepada pemerintah saja. Karena kalau tidak dilakukan secara seksama dan hati-hati, memfokuskan dengan satu institusi saja, lembaga saja, atau pemangku kepentingan saja, maka Anda bisa melakukan atau mendapati salah kelola dengan pemangku kepentingan lainnya, seperti yang sudah disampaikan Bapak Duta Besar tadi, untuk berdiskusi bukan saja di ITU tapi forum-forum lainnya dan juga pemangku kepentingan lainnya dengan komunitas masyarakat madani, dipastikan untuk terlibat juga di dalam sini. Organisasi masyarakat madani sama halnya juga dengan pemerintah. Jadi kami akan mengekspansi diskusi ini bukan saja untuk memperkuat tangan pemerintah di lembaga-lembaga yang terkait dengan internet, tapi juga memberikan kontribusi yang bernilai dan juga kesetaraan dalam berpartisipasi. Kita sudah dengar kemarin dari akademik dan juga masyarakat madani punya peran sendiri, dan kita harus memperhatikan kepentingan mereka juga. Kami, Amerika Serikat, mengakui dan menghargai bahwa harus melibatkan negara-negara berkembang lainnya juga, dan kami sudah memasukkan komitmen Brazil secara domestik di negara kami untuk memastikan bahwa sistemnya adalah sistem multi-stakeholder, ada friendship untuk mengekspansi sistem multi-stakeholder dengan negara-negara lainnya. Dan meskipun ITU adalah salah satu dari berbagai lembaga yang bisa melakukan upaya tersebut, tapi mungkin bukan yang paling sempurna. Saya juga ingin tahu secara terpisah. Kami menghargai cara bagaimana Brazil menyusun legislasinya, Marco Civil, dan baru dirancang dan merupakan suatu hasil kerjasama, dan saya tadi bertemu
debates on the construction of that text, and it produced a call for a free and open internet in Brazil that the Brazilian government has embraced. We do still have some outlying concerns with potential inclusion of localization requirements, but nonetheless, the underlying text and the underlying intent of the Marco Civil legislation and the effort that Brazil has made to incorporate its civil society and its industry in the construction of that legislation is an admirable one, and we want to commend that. Further, we've followed with great interest the recent news stories about the potential for an internet summit that would be held in Brazil in April 2014. And I want to take this opportunity with my counterpart, the ambassador from Brazil here, to reiterate that Brazil and the United States share a vision of the internet that ensures freedom of expression, security, and respect for human rights. We also share an interest in strengthening the existing democratic governance structures with inputs from governments, civil society, and the private sector. And given these common principles and vision that the U.S. and Brazil share, I appreciate Brazil's leadership role on this issue, and we look forward to hearing more about what the summit itself will seek to achieve and if there's a way in which we can be of assistance. But as we approach the summit and as we continue this discussion going forward, please understand that the United States government strongly believes that the global community is best positioned to benefit from a vibrant and growing internet environment where commercial, civil society, and government stakeholders jointly participate in the existing distributed set of internet institutions, each performing specific tasks without unnecessary duplication or encroachment on the role of others. Again, we welcome this debate. We appreciate the opportunity to engage in cooperation and collaboration on the challenges we face. And we hope we can get to a place where everyone, particularly our friends in the developing world, can fully engage the multi-stakeholder system, helping to bolster its accountability, inclusiveness, and responsiveness to the needs of the global community of internet users. I hope we can think creatively in order to bring more developing country governments along with their counterparts in civil society, academia, and industry to the table of our multi-stakeholder institutions. And I hope we can grow and evolve together. After all, that's the point of what's brought us here today. It's a common appreciation for the good that the internet has enabled and can enable for those who are not yet connected, and an interest in the future of the internet. So I look forward to working collaboratively with everyone at this table, and again, I very much appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts. As we move forward in this conversation, if the audience would like to have a more detailed conversation about the text itself, we can do that. And again, thank you very much for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you. I suggest we move down the table. Without further ado, Virat, would you be next?
Thank you, Marcus. Excellencies, Honorable Minister, fellow panelists, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Some remarkable points have been made already this morning by some very eminent panelists, which strengthen the proposition that I seek your permission to make. The concept of multi-stakeholderism, let me say at the outset as we see it from the private sector, includes the business and has the business playing a very vital role as a key stakeholder in the bottom-up, transparent, inclusive internet governance related decision-making processes. This is the essence of the Tunis agenda, and to interpret it in any other manner would be to do injustice to this fine document that has withered the test of time, notwithstanding the multiple and significant developments, several IGFs, including this 8th IGF being held in this beautiful city of Bali. Let me elaborate the rationale behind this submission. Close and informed partnership between the government and other multi-stakeholder groups is not only necessary, but in fact a conditional precedent to an enlightened internet governance approach, and that includes the four themes, three of the four themes laid out by the Honourable Minister from UK. Governments often try to balance many competing priorities in their role to implement and enforce policies in national and public interest. However, in the internet world, somewhat different from the old traditional telecom world, the government is neither a big player itself in most cases, nor does it have years of accumulated technical and economic capacity to manage this piece on its own. This distinction is important between internet and traditional telecommunications, and the Tunis agenda must be seen from the prism of this fine distinction, as should be the role of global multilaterals such as the ITU. The government is not always very close to the facts of the various stakeholders that the government represents, whether the private sector, the technical community, the civil society, and especially the youth. Sometimes a new policy initiative sounds like a tremendous and a simple idea, but in fact that policy can have chain reactions that can unintendedly disrupt other processes and assumptions, and by consequence the work of other stakeholder groups. That's because policy could be based on a set of incomplete understanding of the current environment or simply a wrong set of assumption, and therefore ongoing engagement, not just consultation, but including the inputs provided by various stakeholders is crucial. So the government, with its tremendous responsibility on its shoulders, must move very carefully and deliberately with a well-informed understanding and an openness to consult, engage, and include the inputs from industry, technical communities, and civil society. It is precisely for these reasons why multi-stakeholder institutions are of such great value. They have mechanisms built in to ensure that the dialogue must happen. And in turn, this is the biggest risk that faces traditional multilateral institutions based on policy making, where only governments have a formal role. There is a risk in a multilateral fora and intergovernmental bodies, whose importance is otherwise second to none, that the essential consultative process and the process of including the inputs between the governments and other multi-stakeholder processes may not occur in a complete or a meaningful or a timely manner. Each one of those is important if the roles have to be performed in the manner that we expect them to be and be meaningful. This is particularly vital in fields such as internet, where no doubt there are important government policy concerns, but also the actual management of infrastructure, network, devices, spectrum, and several other resources, as well as the whole concept of permissionless innovation is undertaken by a multiple set of stakeholders outside the government. Let me reference the VISIS for a moment. It is always clear from the VISIS that the issue is not government versus multi-stakeholder. That's a false distinction. It has always been each entity participating according to its mandate and expertise. Government and other stakeholder groups have different and complementary mandates and expertise. The day-to-day technical operations of Internet were never understood to be the mandate of the governments, but rather the mandate of Internet technical communities, which in most cases are also understood to be the private sector. However, it has always been understood that the governments have a key role in the development and implementation of policy, as was laid out by the Honourable Minister from UK. But the framework, including the legal framework, as I had submitted for your consideration, and in doing so the government must rely on all members of the Internet community to develop the best and the most complete public policy. This point was underscored by the understanding that Internet governance is much broader than domain name systems, its value, culture, policy, technical operation that comprises the Internet. As such, an effective Internet ecosystem must rely on all parts of the society, the government, the private sector, and the civil society, according to their expertise and mandate. Let me close this comment by re-emphasizing that the multi-stakeholder governance is therefore a system by which all Internet ecosystem participants, including the government, in their mandate and expertise, work on an equal footing for the greater benefit for a stable and innovative Internet environment. I would, in addition, place an additional responsibility on the government, especially in cases where a strong culture for consultation and inclusion of views does not exist. That is precisely in these situations that the government should not only embrace multi-stakeholderism, which goes beyond consultation and into a meaningful engagement, but in fact act as a facilitator and a catalyst of multi-stakeholder, bottom-up, inclusive, transparent decision-making processes for Internet governance. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. That was Virat Bhatia speaking and not Jari Arko. The scribes followed the list of speakers we had circulated before. Please make sure that for the archives you correct this and make sure that it was Virat Bhatia. We now turn to Jari Arko, the chairman of the ITF. Please, Jari.
So I actually think if the minutes show that previous speech was from me, that would have been very good, very wise words. Thank you. So thank you, Marcus, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to talk, and many wise words have already been said. And I'm sort of struggling a little bit to figure out what to say in addition. But as a representative of the technical community, I look at this from the angle of what kind of cooperation we need with the governments, and from a very practical perspective. And I wanted to raise 3 comments basically. First, historically the internet technology was largely under the radar and there was little need for regulation, policies or government involvement. Fast forward to 2013, the internet is critical to all of our daily lives. Now we are finding in the technical community that there are areas where there's a need to discuss between the governments and ourselves. The engineers at the ITF and elsewhere have realized that they cannot work on the technology alone in all cases, and that things like emergency calls are something that we have to work on in the larger community. Standards in this area are of course safety critical. It's also very much a case for needing one standard for the whole world, as otherwise when I travel from Finland with my smart device here to Bali, it might not be able to do emergency call here. Another example is technology for dynamic radio frequency allocation using something we call white space for wireless communications. The technical community is not in the business of deciding what frequencies are white space or setting the requirements on how static or dynamic allocation happens. Governments and intergovernmental bodies are. But the technical community is building the protocol components for the dynamic negotiation between an access point and an administrative agency, such as the effort that we have at the ITF called PAUSE, the PAUSE working group. We need to understand the requirements for this functionality, and the various agencies need to be comfortable with the types of solutions being built. My second point is that we all talk about how the internet has enabled incredible innovation, and when we talk about governance issues or the involvement of governments this week, it is important to think about them in terms of what the future will bring and not just today's internet. I wanted to highlight something that we see in the technical community very well, and at the ITF as well. The speed of innovation is increasing. For instance, the web protocol stack is undergoing significant change with HTTP 2.0. Voice over IP is moving to browsers with something called WebRTC. The Internet of Things is coming to many, many devices around us. Fundamental changes even in the basic networking standards are on the way, such as moving from IPv4 to IPv6. And the point that I want to make is that many of these changes have fundamental impacts to Internet governance and the way that various players, including governments, need to view them. Governing an almost limitless address space is very different from governing scarcity. Having any web server be capable of becoming a voice provider will make it difficult to regulate voice traffic. So these are real trends that are happening today. And my third and final point is that I want to talk about the practical issues in working together between the governments and the internet, the technical community. I think all of us have realized that we need to do that, and we need to do more of that than we have done in the past. We have the motivation, but there are a number of practical issues. First is usually little knowledge of what the other side does. I do not have the full picture of how government address technical issues or how regulation processes work. Similarly, the governments have historically talked to other types of organizations about technical or telecommunications matters. Now the situation today is quite different. The world has changed. Most of the work on internet technologies elsewhere, standards organizations are different and may even work in different ways. We both need to learn how the other side works. For instance, at the ITF we have an open model where anyone can contribute and our standards are adopted by a voluntary basis. So in summary, my main point is that I'm not so interested in discussing, or maybe the question of what organization all this belongs to is not so interesting as the actual work. I mean, there's a lot of exchanges that have to be done between the different sides, and a lot of practical discussion has to happen, a lot of learning has to happen, and that's the important thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jari. This is actually the first time an ITF chair is attending an IGF meeting and addressing an IGF meeting, and in many ways I would consider the IGF is the policy equivalent to the IETF. We don't take decision, we have a rough consensus approach here as well. Over to you, Avri, civil society perspective with a strong technical background.
Thank you. I'm actually quite pleased to be up here with all these gentlemen in Bali, and I need to point out at one point I was sort of introduced as a representative of civil society, and to keep myself out of trouble I must indeed say that my comments have not been reviewed by anyone in civil society, and in fact I come with sort of a luxury of having been a civil society participant in policy worlds such as ICANN, in technical worlds such as IETF, and the IGFs, etc. So I'm actually given quite a luxury of sort of looking. When I look at the role of governments, I have to admit that I came to the acceptance of governments having a role very late in life. And my first reaction for many years was, why? Why would they have a role? Now, over the years of IGF and such, and having listened to many wise ambassadors, ministers, and chairmen, I've actually come to accept that there is a role. But in looking at that role, I look for where would that role grow from? What would be the origin of a government role? One of the first things that comes to my mind in terms of looking at a role for governments is indeed human rights and universal declarations of human rights and other instruments that have made the governments responsible for protecting our rights in the non-internet world and protecting our rights on the internet. So that role of theirs as a protector of our rights does indeed mean that they really do have a role, and I see that role as stemming from that. But in terms of understanding how that role can be played and how that role can be developed really depends on the degree to which they are defending those rights, the degree to which they are supporting a multi-stakeholder process that can be seen as growing out of our right to participate, to associate, to express, to learn, to share knowledge. So insofar as they protect us, insofar as they further the enterprise, indeed governments do have an important role. But that role really needs to be gauged by the degree to which they are indeed serving the people of the world, serving the people of their countries. The governments have come to the internet sort of late. And so in that role, very often we do an analogy to the role that they took in telecommunications and have tried to sort of impose the role they took in telecommunications on the ideas of the Internet. Now, as we sit here on this panel, I'm very relieved to hear sort of that hasn't been the position of anyone on this panel, and yet I do have concern that is still the position of many in many governments, and believe it's something that we need to be careful of. One thing I see as a very important role for governments in multi-stakeholder processes is their capacity growth. That governments are new in many ways to the notions of cooperating with other sectors of society. Many have listened to us in various times, but they don't necessarily work with us. They don't necessarily cooperate. So over the years from the Working Group on Internet Governance to the WSIS, to the evolution I've seen in the IGF, I have actually watched the capacity of governments to cooperate, both among themselves and with the rest of the stakeholders, has increased. And I think that is also a very important part of government's role in these organizations, in these processes, is to actually increase their capacity to basically participate in a participatory democracy with us, that the democracy goes beyond the one that has elected many of them as representatives or perhaps as first or second order derivatives of representatives, but has actually something where they have learned to actually work with others. I'm very pleased as we get to the point where we hear that governments are indeed fostering freedom of expression, or at least are planning to, and indeed doing so at times. But that's new, and so that's something that I'm hoping that as governments become more involved, it does become more, that they do more to defend and support freedom of expression on the Internet, freedom of association on the Internet, freedom of assembly on the Internet. We need to go beyond. We need to basically look at all of the human rights that governments are charged with protecting and make sure that they are indeed doing that on the Internet. And I'm really glad to see a realization of that, a growth in that process. Governments have a role in multi-stakeholder processes. The ITU has a role in multi-stakeholder processes. They are important roles. But I have a concern as they get more involved, as they get more of a role, that their role isn't a role that pushes the rest of us out of the tent. And so that's something that perhaps, again, being a sort of not having to vet my comments, that I basically can admonish us to really maintain a focus on, that as governments get more of a role in the Internet, that role does not in some way decrease the role of others in the Internet. So how can the governments continue to be involved without, in a sense, disturbing the involvement of the rest of the players in there? So as we approach 2014 with various summits and various proposed summits, I'm really looking at them with a bit of apprehension in terms of, will we be allowed to observe? Will we be allowed to participate? And the point to which we really haven't gotten yet, will we be allowed to participate in the decision-making? Because once we are involved in the decision-making with governments, governments will, in my view, have gotten to the point where their role in the multi-stakeholder process has actually come to fruition. Thank you.
Thank you, Avri. Yes, that was a very interesting first round, and I wonder whether any of the panelists would like to have a spontaneous reaction to what one of the other panelists said? If not, we would then go to the... Yes, please. Ambassador Fonseca, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You were too quick, but I like to make very brief comments. Just to highlight and stress that we do not see there is a contradiction in operationalizing the role of governments and disturbing the multi-stakeholder model. We do not see there is a contradiction. On the contrary, we think that through capacity building, through information and the identification of avenues for cooperation, some of the difficulties that were highlighted by other participants can be addressed, namely the identification of cases in which governments would feel comfortable enough to know there are processes that are taking place that do not require their participation. So I think that maybe rather than expanding the role or being an avenue to expand the role that can give comfort to governments that some of their concerns are being addressed, and maybe identify ways through which from a national point of view, a contribution can be made. Because, for example, if a government feels that in some aspect of internet governance there is not sufficient input from some country, it can be identified that it would not maybe be appropriate for the government to provide the input, but other stakeholders from the country, and then we can also discuss how that can be addressed. So we see this exercise as something that is not leading to let's say, the kind of danger that was highlighted. I think the danger is real. We must address this and make sure it does not, that by pursuing this we are not, let's say, giving rise to something that is unintended, that would harm the multi-stakeholder model. And important aspects we feel should be discussed, but with the full participation of all stakeholders. And this is the meaning of the minister coming here. This was very clearly expressed by President Dilma, and it was also said that if you are not tweetable, you are not in the world. And President Dilma yesterday, she tweeted and she expressed clearly the adherence to the multi-stakeholder approach, and she highlighted that she was sending Minister Paulo Bernardo here to highlight that message. One point also I'd like to make, and I want to be very clear about that Brazil Marco Civil, the Internet framework we are discussing in Brazil, basically all its portions emerged, as was said by another party, through consultations that were held previously. In that sense, there is a difference to the localization requirement that was included later on, but it must be said that this was included as a result of the unfortunate developments that have been taking place in the last 6 months regarding disclosures of information, and this is one thing that occurred to government that should be made. This is part of the reaction. This, of course, is going to be discussed in Congress. Parties will have plenty of opportunity to intervene. There are different views. Some views argue it's not a good idea. Others will defend the opposite. There is a vibrant debate in Congress and in the Brazilian society now. And this is part of the democracy, of the legitimate mechanisms we have. The Congress will debate and make a decision on this. So this is also something I'd not like to let untouched in this meeting. And finally, and I am sorry for taking so long, just to highlight that we are very comfortable with this discussion, since Brazil is coming from a point in which we fully embrace multi-stakeholder model. We participate in the discussion with this approach. The government indeed tries to play this facilitating role, catalyst role in regard to multi-stakeholder participation. And we view Internet evolve into a new paradigm of cooperation among countries, and we want to be part of that.
Again, we do not aspire to a leadership role. We don't think in the internet it has a place for leadership, but rather if we can assist and work together with all parties to address some of those concerns, we'd be more than happy to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I note that at least on the panel we have a large consensus on the role of government. That there is, I noted the government as a partner, and there is no dichotomy between government and multi-stakeholder cooperation. And several speakers identified the need for capacity building, for building a culture of engagement, consultation, and the capacity to for cooperation. And also, this is a process. We have not reached the end point, but we have made huge progress in developing a culture of talking to each other. I do remember also the beginning of WSIS, where it was rather awkward, where it was difficult. The techies had to learn diplomatic language. Diplomats had to learn to be more technical. But I think here now we have reached a level of, I would say, a comfort zone that we can engage in dialogue. And now I'm looking forward to the dialogue that Jeanette and Matthew will engage from the floor. But can we maybe first turn to our remote moderators? Do we have contributions from? No, I see heads nodding. Okay, over to Jeanette and Matthew.
By way of kickstarting the debate, I'd like to offer a metaphor that I picked up from Ambassador Fonseca Filho's comment, and that is the notion of a living book. Perhaps we could actually look at this debate as an ongoing book we co-author or have been co-authoring over the last 10 years. From that perspective, we have perhaps reached now volume 3. When we look back at the discussion, and Markus just mentioned that during WSIS, we could clearly see a very antagonist atmosphere and also an antagonist language that we were all speaking. And now we have sort of moved so much closer to each other's perspectives and positions that perhaps we have now reached a point where we can indeed turn to more operational issues. Several of the speakers suggested that we should indeed look at practical issues of multi-stakeholderism. What do the stakeholders, what do they need to do to actually make this work in a better way than in its infant stage? So Markus suggested the idea that the IGF might become a policy equivalent to the IETF. Is that conceivable? And what would it require to make this work? As you know, we have a list of questions that you can refer to, but of course you can also come up with your own questions if you have different ones. You can use the piece of papers that have been distributed, but you can also just grab a mic, whatever you like. So here are, and I run a foundation called Media for Change. Thank you, Bali, and they say Kisme Salamat. Thank you so very much for a culture of innovation and acceptance. As the theme today is building bridges, and we have had very eloquent speeches, I'll keep my remarks brief. I want to carry the conversation further from where we left off yesterday, and these are called the taxi driver's diaries on internet and governance, because this is about innovation. I mentioned yesterday briefly about how they would ask me if I needed a taxi today, yesterday, day after, and I kept saying no. Since we're looking at an interesting problem to solve, here's what happened yesterday evening. They offered me a card and they said, do I want to change my destination, or is it some other day that I'd like to take the taxi? I believe we're building bridges, but when we start to build bridges over choppy waters, it is important to set new landmarks and find common grounds of conversations. My question is to Ambassador Fonseca. As we briefly mentioned, when it comes to civil society, our challenges are many, especially when civil society and academia from developing countries countries are trying to get to a location which might need 30 hours of flying. There's a lot of common ground that India and Brazil share in culture, in democracies, in common cultures and histories and practices. We want to know whether we will be part of this conversation and how. When we talk about intergovernmental bodies and when we look at an experiment which is truly inclusive, bottoms up, transparent, like the IGF, it gives us opportunities to engage with each other in terms of conversations that we can have. We want to know whether we will be in the room and what is it that you will do to facilitate these conversations. Thank you so very much. Next.
Jeanette, I've got somebody here. My name is Sonigitu Ekpe from Government. My own is a question. How can Internet of Things be used to promote global governance and regional integration of nations, since bilateral and multilateral agreements are not guaranteed due to challenges of transboundary policies and failure of legal framework to promote equality among nations and human rights?
Next is Norbert.
Thank you. Norbert Bollo speaking on behalf of the Swiss Open Systems User Group, which is an open source organization in Switzerland. I would like to start by quickly commenting on the idea that maybe the IGF is the policy equivalent of the IETF. I would say maybe the IGF could be part of something like that, but certainly a layer would need to be added on it that actually produces policy documents. The IGF does not create anything like internet drafts and RFCs. A layer, we absolutely need a layer to create something like that for policy. Addressing more the role of governments, and obviously this kind of RFC-like process, it would strongly need to be tied somehow to the governments so that this output process from the IGF would become an input process for actual government or national lawmaking action. What's the point of having outputs if they are not used for anything? Speaking more specifically from the perspective of our group, which I said we are very interested in open source. We have been engaging in the IGF process for some years, and there are always great workshops here on the topics that we are interested in, but I have a big frustration. What needs really to happen on the ground with governments actually understanding this and understanding how it can be used to apply to their problems and then doing it, making it happen, that is simply not happening. What is happening right now is that there are some things that are very much in the interest of big international companies, and they have the capacity and skills and understanding to get done what is in their interest to do, but the things that are not so much of their interest, they simply don't tend to get done. And I think governments need to take a much stronger role in just making these things happen. For an example, I would mention that free and open source software can have a huge role, a critically empowering role in preventing communication surveillance by foreign intelligence services. But this is not something that will happen on its own. It will need to be brought forward. My organization is very happy to be part of it, but governmental stakeholders also need to be part of it, otherwise it's simply not going to happen. Thank you.
Paminda.
Hello, yeah. I'm Parminder from an NGO IT for Change, and I thank the panel to have presented one of the most interesting and useful session I have ever been at and any IGF, and I'm very sure this session's transcripts will be analyzed and seen for some time. I also thank the Honourable Minister from the UK to lay out a very good vision of what they see as the role of government, which I completely agree, and then Ambassador Benedicto to have added a few points which makes it more contextual to the governance at the global level. Also, Virat Bhatia said a very important point, meaningful engagement. I think there are those points of agreement, and I take Janet's evocation that we move to practical steps. And before that, I want to just have some clarifications. Like I did hear that people should do it in their respective roles. Well, Tunis agenda is not sacred, but some kind of respective roles. But then I also heard equal footing. And when we go to practical things, that kind of thing needs a little more clarification. And I completely build on Virat Bhatia saying that it should be about a meaningful engagement and institutionalizing meaningful engagement. But then I heard every say we need to participate in decision making, we as in non-gov stakeholders. And I think then line drawing is very important about what is the role of government. And when I say government, two things. I mean a democratic government, and I mean all pillars of the government, which is executive, judiciary, legislature. The role of the government for me are two. One is that they are the final institution which determines what public interest is. They take inputs, but they have then final judgment on the public interest. And then secondly, they use that judgment to make public policies which have a coercive force on citizens, and therefore they can only be done in a very responsible manner. So as long as there are not other stakeholders who want to be doing these two things, they have to participate, they have to be consulted, there should be institutionalized engagement model, but as long as they don't come and want to be doing that, that's important because that's a very basic democratic principle. And I often hear in the room that they want to be a part of decision making on equal footing, a term whose meaning I completely lose. And that is of concern of many groups who believe in democracy and who believe in global democracy, and multi-stakeholderism should not become a way to subvert democracy, and the participation process should not become a way to paralyze public policy making, because public policy is very important for marginalized sections who want greater equalization.
There are lots of people who want to speak.
Power. Yes, Janet. So a paralysis of public policy should not be allowed to be created in that sense. Thanks, Janet.
Thank you, Parminder. Is there somebody on the panel who would like to take this up and respond? Okay, then.
Hello, I'm Salinieta Tamanika Omaro, Sala for short, and I'm speaking on my own behalf and not for anyone. I'd just like to first ask a question and then actually it's Salinieta, but that's okay. In terms of internet governance forums, and this is a question I pose to the panelists, in your mind, in the year 2013, is public sector, private sector, and civil society, are they equal players when it comes to the Internet Governance Forum? That's my question. And the brief commentary, a very brief comment from me before I take my seat, and very quick, is this. For there to be a multi-stakeholder cooperation, and in terms of building trust and cross-collaboration, you can't have suspicion. And whilst you can have suspicion, where you have suspicion, trust can't really be built. And so that's why I asked my question.
We have a remote participant. Can we maybe cut and go to the remote moderators?
Thank you. The avatars of remote participation here. Previously there was a comment and probably a request for everyone to keep the microphone closer to the mouth so that the remote participants can hear or speak a bit louder. The question comes from Wafa Ben Hassin from Tunisia, and she says, how can we ensure that the governments have a legitimate and sincere interest in promoting multi-stakeholderism? And how can we overcome the lack of trust that emanates from all the sides, probably all the stakeholders also, particularly in developing countries? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Mishi Chaudhary. I run a non-profit organization in India. My question is to the ambassador from the U.S. government. If the U.S. government really believes in the multi-stakeholder model it is espousing, what are the short-term and long-term plans of its practicing what it's preaching, wherein the entire world is now lost in the deluge of the revelations and is unable to see governments in any other light despite their important role? Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to respond?
I do wish to respond. The question is eminently fair. And the question, as I understand it, is how do your values, professed values, match your behavior? And again, a perfectly fair question. We have multiple systems by which we incorporate our multi-stakeholder community into our policymaking process. I actually come out of civil society. I started my career as an activist, an immigration activist in Washington. The senator who became president of the United States started his career as a community organizer and a civil society activist in Chicago. The Secretary of State started his career as an anti-war activist after the Vietnam War, and one of the most famous visions of that was his participation before the United States Senate and the testimony he gave after the war that helped mobilize the system in opposition to the Vietnam War and the closing of that particular event in our history. I can go through a litany of mechanisms by which we incorporate the public sector, academia, the technical community, industry in our public policy processes. We have an open advisory committee process. We have an open regulatory process. We have an open congressional process, and we have an open press. As it relates specifically to the questions of surveillance and the degree of trust that has been threatened in the internet, and relative to our position as a steward, one of many stewards of the internet, it is again a fair question. The President has spoken to it multiple times. I would let you know, and I'm sure you do know, but I will clarify that there are multiple forms of review ongoing relative to our intelligence review processes. There is an independent review of a 5-panel expert session that will be reporting to the President and to the public. There are congressional reviews and open committee hearings on the subject. And there is an internal system of review within the administration. We, and the President has said on multiple occasions, engage in intelligence gathering operations, much as most, if not all, of the countries of the world do. And we are in the process of ensuring that our intelligence gathering operations are consistent with our values, and we will be reporting to the world as that process moves forward. Again, the President, as you can read in the papers today, spoke with the French Prime Minister and made that comment again. So hopefully that answers your question, and I'd be happy to elaborate on it if necessary.
Thank you very much. Just to remind you, one of the questions here also refers to the rights and concerns of users in other jurisdictions. That is perhaps an issue that can be discussed in this environment. What about state actions that actually affect users, citizens of other jurisdictions? Thank you.
Jeanette, please, can I make an organizational announcement?
Yes.
This issue obviously is high on the agenda of this year's IGF, and the session on emerging issues will be devoted on government surveillance. It will be on Friday morning, and don't look at the program as it is printed. Consult the program as it is on the website. We agreed that yesterday with the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group. the new program will be the whole morning will be devoted to that issue. So there's a 3-hour session on Friday morning devoted to government surveillance. And please keep consulting the website for changes. This was just an organizational announcement. This issue will also be discussed, I would imagine, in the special session on human rights on Thursday afternoon. And there may be other sessions and workshops as well. So.
Je peux y aller? Oh, thank you. I am Jangir from Bangladesh. I am working on a non-profitable organization. My question is, I would like to share one issue. Example, the issue is one policy in developing countries is maybe working fine and good, but it may be challenges in developing countries. So how can we resolve by implementing this issue by global policy, or may we need internet government policy for resolve this issue locally? If not resolved locally, so how can we bridge between global and local policy to resolve this type of issue? An issue, one of issue I share you, for example, access control or filtering or cyber security. Thank you.
Merci. Je remercie les panélistes. Pour moi, en fait, je ne sais pas si je peux y aller, hein, pour ceux qui doivent traduire. Pour moi, en fait, le gouvernement a naturellement la fonction de garantir la neutralité. Il a également la fonction de garantir le bien commun, sans omettre sa fonction primaire qui est celle de la défense du bien public. Mais la question aujourd'hui, c'est de savoir comment faire pour que l'action publique ne se confonde pas à l'action des individus qui assurent le service public dans un espace Internet qui est entièrement consacré par deux mots. Le mot business, affaires, pour ceux qui sont dans le monde d'affaires, et le mot espace public et liberté pour ceux qui sont du secteur public et de la société civile africaine en général. Comment faire pour qu'on arrive à ce sillage-là de centralité?
Thank you very much.
Good morning. My name is Andres Piazza from LACNIC. The Internet Addresses Registry for Latin America and the Caribbean. The question is related to the recent launch of the Montevideo Statement done by 10 Internet organizations, and specifically not only directed to the two ambassadors in the panel, but also to the rest of the panelists. The question is, what do you think about the oversight role, and how would governments should behave regarding this role in the future, or maybe how this oversight role should evolve in the short future?
Thank you. Anybody wants to take this up? Please go ahead.
Actually, I wanted to respond to the remote participant from Tunisia whose question is pending, and also my distinguished delegate here who spoke about how do you combine the developing country piece with the what's happening at the global level, and how do you make it relevant? And I'll draw upon the 4 pieces that the Honourable Minister from UK lent out, and if you look at that, that actually lends itself to a perfect example of how it's done, and I'll try and reference India a little bit because of the developing country part of the question. Building infrastructure, as he spoke about, one of the first ones, unless the government provides the environment which is investor friendly and works with the private sector very closely, it would be virtually impossible to build infrastructure for the kind of internet that we see in the future. In fact, in countries like India, vast majority of the infrastructure and subscribers of the approximately 900 million that are on the net, are on mobile, and about 160 million who are on the net, is owned and run by the private sector, and so government has a crucial role in consulting and implementing that. Legal frameworks he spoke about, again, you can't do that unless you engaged every stakeholder in the community, especially the civil society, the lawyers, those who are going to be impacted by what's in the legal framework. Defending free speech, gender equality, removing child pornography, he spoke about those issues, require a lot of engagement with civil society groups, people who specialize in these parts, because if the laws are not written in a manner that is acceptable. So each of the pieces that the Honorable Minister spoke about actually lends itself to how institutionally governments would get involved in the multi-stakeholder engagement in a meaningful manner. But to answer the Tunisian question, I think from the developing country perspective, where the traditions are not strong for seeking consultation or including inputs into policy making, then in those areas writing laws or principles that ensure such consultation actually does help, and building such independent institutions does help. I'll just close by saying that in the telecommunications infrastructure that we built, which now underlays the entire internet traffic that is growing in India and the subscriber base, there is a requirement under law for the regulators to consult and act in a transparent manner, and a provision is available to those who are not happy with the decisions of the government or of the regulators, in case they believe sufficient transparent consultation has not occurred and the inputs have not been taken. So wherever the traditions are not strong, bringing language into law, into policy is always helpful, because then it sort of lays out clearly what different people have to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, hello and good morning. My name is Musab Abdullah. I'm from the regulator in the Kingdom of Bahrain. Basically, I'd like to provide an observation, an emphasis, and finally a query based on the comments. And I'd like to begin by thanking the panelists for all their interventions, and in particular I'd like to thank the Minister from Brazil for his administration's proposal. First of all, it's been my observation through WICIT and the WTPF and the deliberations thereof that there's a lot of mistrust towards government. Sometimes it's a misplaced mistrust. It's just a subconscious bias, to the point where I have found that some people have been asking, why doesn't the Kingdom of Bahrain support the multi-stakeholder model? To which I would respond, well, we do. In fact, we're on record as having stated that. And this is just an example of that sometimes what we're saying is interpreted in light of what we expect to hear rather than what's actually being said. So I would caution against this subconscious mistrust of governments and actually listen to the argument that is taking place. Now, the emphasis I'd like to place goes back to some of the comments raised by the Honourable Minister from the UK, which is what is illegal offline is also illegal online. And this is what's guiding a large part of this discussion on public policies and with the role of governments in that public policy. Because ultimately, we have different laws, we have different customs, we have different frameworks throughout all the countries in the world. And yet, we have one internet. So how do we relate those physical boundaries into this new digital layer of geography that we have, while making sure that everyone's rights and responsibilities are respected? Which finally leads me to my query. Where do we go from here? This has been discussed ever since the Tunis agenda came out, and yet we find ourselves in a loop discussing the same points over and over. Now, hopefully the recent discussions that happened can actually break that cycle. So I ask, where do we go from here? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope we are not in a loop. I still insist that we are moving forward, that the language is really changing. Now there's somebody from Indonesia, from...
Yes, thank you. My name is Edith. I am from Indonesian ICT Society. Actually, I am not questioning, but I like to support what has been mentioned by His Excellency Minister from UK on even I'm coming from the society, but actually on this discussion that I would like to stress that we still do need the intervention of the government. For instance, in Indonesia, we have been witnessing that during these last 2 decades, the development of the internet and this society is very very extremely developing. With bad impact and positive impact also to the society, especially on the values, on the cultures, on the education of the children also. So even as in the portion as the society that I would like not too many control from the government, but when we do think that the negative impact of the internet into the society is not small actually. Especially on the education, in the cultural, and the values, we still do need the maybe not saying that this is control, but the intervention from the government. This is what I like to endorse. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anybody from the panel who wants to comment on this? Otherwise, there would be now a question directed to Honorable Minister Advaisi.
No,
Janet, we have somebody over here who would like to speak, if that's okay.
Thank you very much. My name is Santosa from Indonesian ICT Society. So I just want to continue what my colleague just mentioned regarding the statement made by the Minister Advisory from UK. Well, when the government intervention from the business sector, usually we are thinking that there is another charging will be done. Because usually when they intervene, also related also to the license. License is main cost. So how do you, let's say, act on this kind of, let's say, behavior of the government? I believe in developing country, a lot of government also want to collect the money from this kind of services. Thank you.
I'll try and answer some of the points as best I can. First of all, I'm pleased that my 4 points are now framing the discussion, which was my original intention. So thank you for the last 3 questioners, and indeed some of the panelists to referring to those 4 issues. I think if I start with what the panelist from Bahrain, the regulator from Bahrain said, where do we go from here? Earlier, one of our moderators talked about this being a book that is being continuously written. So one doesn't necessarily know which direction the journey will take. I think the point is that the authors should include everyone from our society, so government, business and civil society in that discussion. That is the fundamental point I want to make. Clearly, as I said in my opening remarks, governments will pass legislation which affects what happens on the internet. We as a government have passed legislation, as I said earlier, that was specifically directed to enable rights holders to send letters to people who were infringing copyright by downloading on the internet. And we did that through legislation, although we haven't actually implemented it. In contrast, in the United States, a voluntary agreement has been reached between the telecom providers and the rights holders to send warning letters to people who are infringing copyright. So the United States has taken a voluntary approach. We've gone down a legislative route. Then you can flip that over, and we allow rights holders to use existing copyright legislation to get an injunction to block a website where infringing material is present. Newsbin 2 was the first website that was blocked in this way, and it was using existing civil legislation. And it didn't cause really any controversy in our country. But by contrast, in America, when that was proposed as legislation, it caused a titanic debate, and that proposal was dropped. So in terms of how government legislates, different cultures will take a different approach, and two very similar cultures, perhaps the UK and the US, sometimes take different approaches to tackling the same issue. But I return to my point that that is government intervention in an issue which happens to involve the internet, if I can put it that way. So we as governments take the protection of intellectual property extremely seriously. Clearly the internet affects how intellectual property can be attacked. We take the protection of our children extremely seriously. Clearly the prevalence of the internet affects how children can be affected by inappropriate content. And so there's nothing, I think, philosophically, there's no kind of philosophical barrier that says government shouldn't intervene in this way. But where I feel very strongly, and I think my government feels very strongly, is that government shouldn't seek to put in place a framework to control the internet. And we feel that for philosophical reasons, because of our support for freedom of expression. But we also feel it for practical reasons, because we've seen the innovation that a free internet has brought about. The barriers to entry being relatively low, the opportunity to engage with millions and now billions of people in different ways are absolutely formidable. So I think when we are debating this constant debate, this constant journey about the multi-stakeholder approach versus a government regulatory approach, everyone should realize, and trust is important here, but everyone should realize, developed nations and developing nations, how important the multi-stakeholder approach, and it was formalized at WSIS, but it's always been there, how important that approach has been to supporting the innovation we've seen on the internet. And that if you take a top-down approach, you risk shutting out incredibly important voices who have just as valid points to make about the future direction of the internet. So, the internet is constantly evolving. We don't know what the 4th, 5th or 6th volumes of the book we're writing collectively will be. But as I say, the fundamental principle must be that there should be multiple authors with equal voices.
Thank you very much. Perhaps, can I just ask a follow-up question and remind you of the first question that was collected? And there was, the first one actually asked whether the governments which pitch for multi-stakeholderism in the international arena also adopt internet-related policymaking in their respective countries within a multi-stakeholder approach. Since you referred to domestic legislation regarding protecting intellectual property rights, could you imagine, as the UK government, to do this within the framework of multi-stakeholder policy making?
Well, I mean, we do follow through in the sense that we were the first ones, I think, to set up a domestic IGF. We have the multi-stakeholder advisory group on internet governance, which helps frame our policy towards the internet. But again, we as a government obviously consult on all our legislation. So we are a free, open and democratic society. Whatever legislation we propose, regardless of whether it relates to the internet or not, is consulted upon. It can be challenged. In fact, the legislation that we put in on intellectual property, which was specifically aimed at protecting intellectual property rights on the internet, was challenged in the courts. And government, we had to amend the legislation as a result. Only in a small technical way, we effectively won the court case. So we always do consult. But again, it's important to say that I think our approach to the internet, in internet policy making, is very much multi-stakeholder.
Thank you. There was another comment on the panel.
I was just going to add on this whole issue about the constant changing scenario and the changing role of the governments. And I just want to reference the case from India again for your consideration. As I said, we have about what the world's second largest population first second largest population in the world, and then the second largest mobile population in the world. And consumers who use mobile phones were contributing 5% of their total bill every month to the USO fund. But the business was so good and it grew so well that the need for the USO fund to put out phones in rural areas and those who couldn't afford it was never required. So billions of dollars were collected by way of this fund. And the government changed tack midway about 5 years ago and converted the USO fund that was meant for rural telephony and changed the rules, changed the legislation, and is using that money to build the first large $4.5 billion national fiber optic network, which will be devoted in ensuring that 250,000 villages are connected through that process. This is one of the many things that the government can do, as this book is written on the first piece that the Honorable Minister spoke about, which is building infrastructure, where in a unique case, consumers have contributed to money for rural telephony, which has now gone on to build a national internet backbone. So I'm just giving you one example, but there are many such places where governments can continue to innovate in their role as this book is written, because it couldn't have been imagined that this would be the use of this fund even 5 years ago.
Thank you very much. Now hand over to you.
Thank you. My name is Dwi. I am from Ministry of ICT of Indonesia. I would like to address my opinion about multi-stakeholder. First of all, about the motivation of each party involved in multi-stakeholder itself. So there is a huge difference of motivation from each party. For example, in the government, we often our motivation to regulate the internet is often motivated by how to keep the country, how to keep the sovereignty of the country. Meanwhile, the private parties, their motivation is mainly about how the demand and supply, how much the profit can I gain from this business. So, and civil society is somehow in between. And the second thing is about multi-stakeholders is I tend to see that developed country who already apply the multi-stakeholder tend to force the multi-stakeholder system to developing country with the same pattern. They seems like want to copy-paste their model, the model of multi-stakeholder in their country to a developing country, which is maybe doesn't work because we have different culture, we have different style, we have different government system in regulating the internet itself. So this is the main concern for me if we're talking about the multi-stakeholders, because like last week I talked with a representative from Microsoft when we discussed about one of the minister regulations. So they often talk about profit, demand, supply, and then we talk about how to keep our country from surveillance, how to keep our society from pornography, how to keep, so this is like kind of like contradict roles and interests. And I hope that Internet Governance, IGF, can facilitate those different interests, how we meet our, at least, I don't hope that we will come up with the same interests, but at least we understand each other. So as a government, I often feel that like society see me as enemy. And some of private company see me also as an enemy when we talk about data protection or building, infrastructure building. Is when the government try to kind of limitation, give limitation, we often seen as an enemy of the internet development.
I think that's a very interesting point, and I think that it's important when government is subject to criticism, and people quite rightly want to say government shouldn't over-involve itself in the internet or regulate the internet. I would echo to a certain extent what you say, that business and civil society must also understand government's perspective. So again, returning to some of the issues that exercise great passion in the UK, protection of our children, protection of intellectual property, it is, I think, incumbent on business and internet businesses to understand what government wants to achieve and to work with government. And funny enough, that is the best way of preserving the multi-stakeholder model. It's the best way of ensuring that this partnership, this very strong partnership which has been so important to the development of the internet, continues. And it's a paradoxical thing when you talk to an internet company who says, we will only do this if you pass legislation, which seems to invite government to regulate the internet. And what they should be saying is, we understand and share your concerns and we'll work with you to provide tools. And that's what's happened in the UK. So with telecoms providers, they now provide the filters for consumers to use if they want to block pornography in their home. And that is a good coming together of a public policy issue working in partnership. So it is important. You're quite right that business and civil society shouldn't see government as the enemy, just as government shouldn't see business and civil society as a problem they have to deal with.
Please, Ambassador Fonseca would also like to react.
Thank you. Actually, I'd like to maybe at this point react to some interventions. I think some very good points were made, and I think we should, to the extent possible, also react to some notions that were presented. So first of all, I'd like to address the professor from India. I think she raised a very important point regarding what would be the Brazil's view in regard to participation of stakeholders, and I understood in the light of the preparation for the meeting in Brasilia. So as I have said at the beginning, we intended to be completely have a participatory nature from the beginning, from the inception. We have, of course, some ideas, and the minister will spell some of those ideas in line with what President Dilma has already expressed at the General Assembly. But we want it to be a constructive work, and that stakeholders should be fully involved. So answering to your questions, yes, we want you to be in the room and be a participant in the process. In regard to the concern that I also expressed, that our proposal should not only be seen as a way to enhance participation of governments. Of course, as government, we are looking how to operationalize the participation of government, but we are also concerned about other stakeholders' participation. I'd like to make reference to a very good partnership we have with the Brazilian Steering Committee. You know, of course, government has budgetary constraints of many nature, but through the Brazilian Steering Committee, participants from civil society are fine. They can come to these meetings with the monies that are collected through the operation of .br. Part of it is also destined to this end. I think this provides a very good example of how we can work constructively. The government is in the Brazilian Committee, so that we are not outside it. But as a body, how it can assist in providing further assistance to other stakeholders. And I say this because, of course, we know of international organizations that collect millions of dollars, and I think it would be very good if that could also be used to support, to have public interest in mind and support the system as a whole. I think that would be a very good way to use the money that is collected. I'd like also to address what Parminder said about equal footing, and I don't think we should maybe engage a lot on this, but as we read, as we go through what is stated in regard to the design of international public policies pertaining to the internet, it is clear that it is something that governments should be implemented is on an equal footing. So the reading of paragraph 69 seems to indicate that as regards the design and adoption of public policies, when we're talking about equal footing, we are referring to governments. And of course, this is in the context of the multi-stakeholder model that is, let's say, an overriding concept that should be there. But as we refer to this particular issue regarding public policy, it's clearly on the side of governments that I don't know if this would address what Parminder said, because sometimes we are confusing that the multi-stakeholder model should embrace everything, and I think it's the part of the beauty of the model is that each stakeholder has roles and responsibilities that are differentiated, and the government cannot, of course, get away from its responsibilities in regard to issuing public policies. Well, another point I'd like to comment, there were many interventions related to how can we expand and have a larger role for IGF, and the notion that IGF could be the policy equivalent to IETF. And I'd like to comment that my delegation strongly supports that IGF would have more effective participation. Its outputs could be more outcome-oriented, maybe is not the word, but would have more resonance outside the context of its meetings. When I was in Baku last year, it was my first IGF, I was extremely pleased with the debate. I could participate, I could attend the wealth of information, of notions that were conveyed, the vibrancy of the debate, and this is not exactly captured as the outcome. I think this is something my delegation will strongly support, that we seek ways, alongside the working group recommendations. I think we should be working on that in that direction. Another point I'd like to comment as well regards this breach of trust, and of course this is something that will be dealt in the final session, but only to say that from the perspective of my delegation, there is some part of a way of addressing this is reinforcing the debate on ethics and privacy. This is something Brazil initiated at UNESCO, and it will be taken up by the next General Conference in November. And I would also refer to the speech that President Dilma delivered at the United Nations, that maybe the time is right for us as a community, international community, to launch a discussion on principles and norms that should govern Internet. And she referred to the concept of an international civil framework based on our own experience. We think this is maybe a constructive way through which we could, out of these circumstances, try to further refine the framework we have. We think it would be indeed a very important development if we could get to this. Another point is the kind of oversight role that governments could play, and I think the question referred to the Montevideo Declaration. I would interpret that maybe this is referred to ICANN specifically, and one thing I'd like to comment in that regard is that we see the oversight role of governments being made without any detriment to the multi-stakeholder dimension of the organization. This is something to be clearly preserved. The multi-stakeholder dimension, the bottom-up decision-making should be preserved, but then we see ICANN evolving and being commensurate with the challenges and the context of the 21st century as an institution that would have an international, let's say, oversight more than one single country oversight. And finally, I'd like just to refer some of the interventions said that developing countries do not have a tradition of consultation. It's very dangerous sometimes to make that kind of statement. Developing countries are more than 100 countries with different circumstances, different contexts. In the case of Brazil, we have a very strong tradition of consulting with civil society. We have had in the last years over 100 national conferences on issues such as human rights, child rights, you name it, that started at local level and then state level, regional level, and finally national level. So we are very comfortable with the notion of consulting widely with the population, and we would say that adds the complexity as we are looking at all the points we are raising from an international perspective. There are so many different ways in which countries deal with those issues that it's a tremendous challenge. And finally, the point, I'm sorry, so many issues, but the point that was raised by, I think, the last speaker regarding motivation of governments. I was a bit surprised because in the case of Brazil, our motivation to participate goes much beyond the protection of sovereignty. We want, through government participation, also make sure there is adequate consideration to the issue of inclusiveness, social inclusiveness, and also fostering an environment for economic prosperity, development. We are also concerned about human rights, child abuse, all this. So it's much complex, I think, the kind of interaction government has. And I fully agree with Minister Advesi that the important thing is to make sure that as government participates in the multi-stakeholder model, it will not be seen in contradiction or being an enemy to other views, rather that maybe the perspectives are different, but the concerns are also very wide, since governments have, of course, as the UK paper indicates, a very wide-ranging responsibility regarding public interest, so that permeates various areas, so it's not restricted to one single concern. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this comprehensive...
Thank you. We have more from this panel, and I would also like to say a few words in terms of organization of the session, picking up from our colleague from Bahrain. Where do we go from here? And also what you said, that we, I think, collectively agree that we want to take the IGF a step further and come to takeaways, more type of tangible outcomes in whatever form they will be. So this can also be in the Chairman's summary that we really, and that is in line with the recommendations from the CSTD working group on IGF improvements, that we highlight where we have points of convergence, but we can also emphasize that there may be points of divergence where we don't agree. But having listened to this discussion, I find we have broad points of convergence, and Minister Vaisi's framework of the 4 themes, I think, found very broad support. While we might discuss on some of the details of the regulation, but I think the fact that governments have a responsibility for infrastructure, for setting the legal and regulatory environment, and also the duty to protect human rights and freedom of expression has been, and nobody contests that, I think, in this room, and it has found broad support. Human rights, to begin with, we didn't discuss that in particular, and that really emerged over the years as a very central issue in internet governance discussions. And then I think maybe first and foremost, when we talk about the role of governments, that we talk about partnership with the other stakeholders, and that governments should not be seen as the enemy. Although some remarks from the floor implied that this may still be the case, but I think, at least I would feel that this room agrees that this should not be, we should move beyond that, and governments should definitely not be seen as enemies. They do have a role, and we have to work with governments. But the remark to that some developing countries may have problems finding their way around the multi-stakeholder system clearly relates to the importance of capacity building, and that was also made, that point was made by several speakers, that we need to assist also developing countries to find their way into the multi-stakeholder system, help them to build a culture of consultation, engagement, and to have the capacity to cooperate. And that can also mean financial assistance, as quite often it's also traveling involved. So where do we go from here? I would agree with my co-moderator Jeanette that we do go forward. Well, sometimes it may seem as we are going around in circles, but I think it is an upward spiral. We may revisit the same issues, but we revisit them at a higher level of understanding, of comprehension, and also of culture of dialogue. But please feel free to disagree with my attempt to try and capture the discussion. This is the only way to validate it, but if you all agree, I think we do have already, I would say, a good takeaway. But let's also listen to from the floor. And before going back to the floor, Ambassador Sepulveda wanted to react. Please.
Very quickly before returning to the floor, I wanted to, in the first instance, understanding that we would all like to see continued improvements in all of our internet governance institutions, including the IGF, I do want to take a moment to value the conversation that we're having right now, and that it is a conversation and not a competition, and a discussion and not a debate, because the pressure of solving or imposing a solution on all as a function of this conversation is not imposed on the conversation itself. I think that there's immense value in that. It allows us to have a frank and open discussion about issues that are that are still not resolved either within ourselves or between us. And that there is an immense amount of value in that process in and of itself. I would hope that we continue to value that. I would also like to take a moment to note that I think there has been immense progress, even in the short time that I've served, in coming closer together on what we see as challenges and what are potential solutions to those challenges. So in the first instance, for example, we wholly agree with the analysis of Brazil and others that developing country governments and developing country societies, including industry and civil society and academia and the technical community in the developing world, does not have adequate participation and does not have adequate room at the table and voice for participation in the existing internet governance institutions. The question then becomes, how do we make that real? And I would say that there has been real progress at the different institutions in making an effort toward that, and I would say that effort call has been heard to a large degree. So, and that manifests itself in the multiple offices that ICANN, for example, is opening around the world. The increase in financial support that is being given to developing countries to go to ICANN to participate in that. The increasing sophistication of the GAC and the increasing participation of the GAC at ICANN, for example. But that isn't to say that we can't do better. It isn't to say that we don't agree that there's a need for collaborative work to improve on the system. And I think that this conversation and the continued conversations and the answer to the question of where do we go from here, well, it sounds like we're going to Brazil in April, but we'll have to see how that particular event is constructed. But then there's Egypt, or where the World Telecommunications Development Conference will be held, and then the plenipotentiary in South Korea. We have continuous meetings because we're building on the previous work and the areas of consensus where we can come together in good faith toward the end that we all want, which is the full inclusion of everyone in the world in an open and inclusive internet. And I think, so from the point of view of the United States and building on many of the things that the minister from the UK has said, we, for example, have a global broadband initiative in which USAID is helping countries around the world in the development of national broadband plans and in the development of universal service fund programs. We spearheaded the Alliance for an Affordable Internet, which is bringing together a public-private partnership with up to 30 different actors from the technological community, from the public sector and the private sector, to talk about what the public policies are that we can put into place, many of which the minister covered are working well in the UK, for example. How can we adapt those kinds of pro-investment, pro-deployment policies around the world to ensure that everyone has access? So I think that we are coming together around a set of common causes that are rooted in the democratic, small d democratic deployment and inclusion of everyone in the global internet. And I think that that's a positive development.
Chair, we have a couple more questions from the floor. Thank you.
Good morning, afternoon. My name is Walter Natris. I'm a private consultant representing the NL IGF.
You speak a bit louder, please.
Is this better? Okay. My name is Walter Natris. I'm a private consultant, but also representing NL IGF. We're going to do some pretty good sessions on Thursday morning and afternoon, in which most of you are somehow represented with best practices on breaking down silos.
You need to put the microphone a bit closer.
Closer?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Like this. That's better. Okay. We're going to have some pretty good examples, actually, with most of you represented in the panels we are doing. But to come to my question, I've got about 3 different ones, which are all together. But I want to start with giving you a very small personal experience I had this month with the Internet Society, where I did represent the Dutch government to teach governments about spam enforcement in the Netherlands. And after I'd given my presentation, what actually happened is that the questions turned to the gentleman next to me representing the ITU in South America and saying, can the ITU help us with this? Instead of asking me how could we do something together, they asked the ITU. And afterwards I went to these people and asked, why did you ask the question to the ITU gentlemen? And they said, well, we asked these questions to the ITU because we do not know anybody else. And this was several local governments from South America. And when I started engaging them further, they said, well, the IETF has never been here and we don't really know anybody from the IETF, so how could we ever do something technical? Well, that's just a few examples. Then I come to my questions, is that how can you, industry, technical community, governments, actually change this in the course of the coming years so that there's more knowledge spread to several regions where perhaps these organizations never come, like the Message Engine Abuse Working Group, which is an industry initiative basically in the US and in Europe. They don't go to South America because they don't have any members there, so there's no sponsoring, no etc. So how could governments actually, together with industry, make sure that this sort of knowledge goes into these regions? So, and as a last question, is there actually a clear view on what the needs of governments in regions where these sort of conferences take place may actually not go to? So is there a clear view on the needs of local governments in developing countries? So thank you.
I suggest gathering questions from the floor. I know that Jari would like to answer, but let's have a final round for the panelists to react to all the questions we gather so that we have a good conclusion.
Can we first give the floor to Avri? She has... Okay. Then the moderator.
Maybe, okay. So Wafa bin Hasina again from Tunisia, and she's also in the United States. So she's asking, there is a moral discrepancy going on when developing countries promote human rights and multi-stakeholder, and yet they don't act on these values. I'm sure that the vast majority of U.S. citizens do not appreciate the privacy invasions that U.S. government has yet to admit to, since we all know this from leaks. How can we adequately discuss the government not being an enemy when our government consciously engage in practices that are diametrically opposite to what our policy platforms articulate? Beyond public-private partnerships, how can we involve the average citizen in this conversation?
Thank you very much. Are we still in the process of collecting questions? Yep. There's Arnold van Rijn.
Thank you. I would like to thank the panelists for their presentations. I really liked the phrase by Minister Fezi when he said that the role of governments should be seen as a network partner instead of someone who dictates. That's precisely what we are doing in the Netherlands. Our government, in particular our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, are right now busy developing a long-term study on how the Dutch telecom market looks like in about 5 to 10 years and what the place of the telcos would be in the internet value chain. This whole process, what is now going on, is a cooperation with all the partners involved, the NGOs, the private sector, the technical society, and so on. So in our view, this national model of cooperation is a good one for the future to continue to build on. And what would be fine and wonderful if it would be in place in an international, on an international level. On the other hand, I heard also from one of the panelists, I think it was Avery Doria, when she stated that she had some concerns about the bigger role of governments in this whole process, because they would push out the other parties out of the tent, if I quoted her correctly. So this indicates, in my view, that we're all struggling to find the right role of governments in this whole process. And I think it touches upon the essence of the multi-stakeholder model, and that is that all parties involved should act on equal footing. Now I have a question for the panel, and that is, how would you interpret the concept of acting on equal footing with respect of the role of governments? Thank you.
Are there any further questions? You have another one? First of all, I'd just like to say that this is a really fantastic conversation, and I'm really glad to see the maturity and the level of trust expressed, and just hearing the diversity of perspectives coming through. And I think for me, hearing this now, it heralds a significant tomorrow for internet governance. And what I'd just like to add to the conversation is this. In terms of the increasing accountability and transparency within existing mechanisms, and I know that a lot of the organizations are already working vigorously and robustly in this area, but this is something that really should be pushed from the IGF space, increasing accountability and transparency. The other thing also is in terms of increasing meaningful participation, it's bringing people to the table. So for example, even within the GAC, within ICANN, I'm not sure, I know that there are 193 countries, but I don't think that you have 193 representatives of governments to the table. And so the issue is not ICANN, the issue is bringing governments to the table and that sort of thing. And by the way, these are my own views, these are not the views of any of my affiliations and associations. The other thing is standards bodies. It doesn't matter whether it's a national standards body or whether it's an international standards body, but ensuring that there's greater accountability and transparency where nations can actually trust, that you can trust that there's integrity in how things are actually processed. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. Nigel Hickson, ICANN. Just a point and a question, if I may. The point is, ICANN's been mentioned a couple of times, and I would like to endorse what our Mexican colleague said, that ICANN is looking to internationalize its operations. We have open various offices in different regions. And
can you put the microphone closer to your mouth?
Yeah, usually my voice is loud enough, but I can do that, yes. So Fadi Jahadi, our chief executive, has embarked on an operation to globalize the whole of the ICANN operation, and many people that come to ICANN meetings can see that firsthand. The GAC is 129 countries. We hope that will be expanded. There might be countries here that are not in the Government Advisory Committee, and we greatly encourage them to be part of it. The question I have is that I don't think I've heard, and I might have been asleep of course, is mention of the World Summit on the Information Society and the review that's currently taking place. I think it was mentioned by the US Ambassador that the ITU review conference is taking place in Egypt, or was going to take place in Egypt in April, of course, and that's an important step. But there's also a further step when the UN General Assembly have to review the WSIS arrangements in 2015. And perhaps the panel might sort of just give an indication of what they hope will happen in terms of the WSIS review. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janet, and thank you, Chair. I'll keep my comments brief. Thank you for the second opportunity. I do want to reiterate the point that a colleague mentioned about keeping solutions local and domestic where problems can be solved locally. But the IGF is a wonderful platform, and Marcus, this is a question for you. I do want to see more young people and more women, especially from emerging economies and marginalized communities, and you wear many hats. So if you could dwell slightly more on the ISOC ambassadors programs, and what is it that IGF as a platform is doing to bring in new voices? That is a real concern we have. Also in terms of solving problems at a local level and internationalizing experiences and institutionalizing best practices, I do want to invite the House and everyone here to an open forum that the Indian government is putting together to tell the India story, because the next billion users are coming online from these parts of the world. So day 3, everyone's welcome, room 3, 11 o'clock. Please do join us. Thank you, Marcus.
Okay, my name is Wolfgang Kleinwächter. I'm from the University of Aarhus, and I want just to add a question to the issue raised by the gentleman from the Dutch Foreign Ministry when he asked the panel what the government think about equal footing. You know, a lot of this multi-stakeholder discussion goes back to the definition of Internet governance, which was elaborated by the Working Group on Internet Governance and adopted by the heads of states. And in the first part of the definition, we have these various roles of government or of stakeholders in their respective roles. But in my eyes, the second part of the definition is even more important because the second part speaks about shared decision-making procedures, shared norms, protocols, programs, and decision-making procedures. And I think Avi raised this, Azar raised this. So when we are moving forward, we have to face that somebody has to take a decision. So my question is to the governments when they react to the question from the gentleman from the Netherlands about equal footing, what is their idea about sharing decision-making with other stakeholders? Thank you very much.
So perhaps the Tunis agenda also needs to be regarded as a living book, where we sort of start to reinterpret original meanings. Shall we hand over to...
Jeanette, maybe I can ask a question or build on some of the questions. We heard from the gentleman from Bahrain that he was asking what's the way forward. Minister Vaisi partially responded to that. Nigel from ICANN has put a question out there as to the evolving landscape over the next 18 months. And I was wondering if the panel would mind commenting on how they see the importance of and how multi-stakeholderism will evolve in the context of the WSIS, the WTDC, the ITU plenipotentiary. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Back to the panel with that. And I think also let's bear in mind that there will be various other sessions during this week that will relate to similar issues. Tomorrow we will have a session on Internet governance principles and on principles of multi-stakeholder cooperation and enhanced cooperation. We will have a session on human rights, and as I already said, the session on emerging issues will be on surveillance. And the very last day, we have the opportunity to, with an open microphone session, to take stock of the whole week, and these issues will be addressed in various sessions. Now, who would like to go first? Shall we just follow down the line and maybe start with Avri? She wanted to talk. Avri, please.
Thank you. Okay. I appreciate this chance to respond to things. There were so many that I would like to respond to, but I think I'll restrict myself to very few. But one of the things that I did want to go back to is a question that we were given on the sheet, the number 3 question in the second set, which says, can the exercise of sovereign rights by nations be restricted when it encroaches the rights of users in other jurisdictions? Or I would go, or even in the rights of users in their own jurisdictions. And I think that one of the things that we need to look at when we're talking about internet governance and the restrictions that some governments do put on the human rights as expressed on the internet. And at a certain point, when those human rights are restricted on the internet, groups like this that go beyond just a single national interest need to look at those and need to look at them very directly and need to basically not flinch away from a certain regard for those human rights because of a older notion of sovereignty that says on the outside of my walls nothing I do can be discussed. Nothing I do can be faulted. And so the Tunis agenda does not restrict us, but rather puts us on an equal footing where anything that goes on in one country is open to the discussion of the rest. If what is going on is not in keeping with human rights as generally known and generally expressed, it is open to our discussion, it is open to our deliberations, and it should be open to our advice. And I think that that's a very important point for us to come back to, is that we can go beyond the narrow notion of sovereignty in the countries, because the countries have agreed to bind themselves, to make themselves responsible to human rights. And I think it's our responsibility in the IGF and in all of our other efforts to always go back to those human rights documents that have been signed, that have been agreed to, and ask the questions, is what a particular country is doing in keeping with their obligations? And I could go much further down those lines, but I think that that is the measuring stick for any of our discussions going forward, and sort of using the cloak of sovereignty to protect actions and philosophies and motivations that go against documents we have signed is something that we really cannot accept silently. And I guess I'll stop at that point.
Thank you. Jari?
Thanks. So again, there were many points. I'll just touch on 2. The first one that I wanted to raise was this question of governments and other types of bodies being more aware of each other. And I think we all have a responsibility for making that to happen. At the IETF, we've had very good success and experiences from the ISOC's policy guest program, where we draw on people around the world from various different places, regulator, government, policymaker type people, and introduce them to the IETF. It's been a very successful program, and thank you, ISOC, for that. I think similar types of programs exist in other organizations. I think the rest of the world could probably take some lesson here as well, and where it's not applied, it's probably a useful model to do. The other thing that we've had good experience with at the IETF is when our leadership, where the working group chairs, experts, ADs, or myself, go out and try to reach out to the other direction, go talk to governments and various types of organizations, and inform of what's coming down the pipe, what's happening, and trying to pull for information. That's also been pretty successful. The other thing is that we all have a responsibility to engage the whole world. I mean, obviously, like internet technology is it's not worked on as uniformly around the world as one might perhaps hope. So, like in my country, in Finland, we have a lot of industry in this field, but it's not true of all countries in Europe, for instance, and certainly not true of the whole world. So it's somewhat centralized, but we have a duty to reach out to the different people working on this topic around the world, and we've been doing this by, again, with another ISAC program where we pull individuals from different countries, developing nations, for instance, and also going out of our way to meet in new places. We're planning a meeting in South America, for instance. The other thing that I wanted to mention was Anders Piazza raised the Montevideo statement and asked about the oversight roles, and there's been a couple of other comments on that as well. I think Ambassador Sepulveda had it right when he said earlier that the multi-stakeholder system is evolving. That is indeed right. Just to give you one example, at the ITF we depend very much on the IANA function to do what we call protocol parameter registry function, and that is basically registering port numbers that have been allocated for a particular purpose. As a long time ago, has been set up as a sort of U.S. government contract type of operation and run by ICANN. After that set up, the communities, ICANN and ITF and IAB and so forth, have actually built quite a lot of machinery around this and policies and processes. So we have signed agreements, we have set service level agreements, we have lots of tooling, we have tracking systems, we have oversight bodies. And so I think that's one example of the evolution, and if there's any further evolution, I certainly hope there will be. It's probably in the form of trusting the models that have been created and moving from one country model perhaps to the models that we now have and actually are running the thing on a daily basis. And then finally, people were asking about the way forward. So my three conclusions are basically that we need to continue connecting the people that have a need to talk to each other, the governments and various other organizations, and it's a two-way conversation. It's not government telling someone else, go do this, or the other way around. It's a two-way conversation. We need the information from the governments, and they have a need to tell us some things as well. Secondly, we need to continue the evolution of the different parts of the overall system for internet governance. And then finally, I think all of these forums and processes and discussions, they just need to be multi-stakeholder, no question about it. We should not even debate that situation where it would be some party that it's only in charge and would not allow others to speak. The internet is for the whole world, and there's many players that have a need to say something when things happen. And if it's not possible to discuss between those different parties, then it's not really working. So I see that we all actually agree on this, and the multi-stakeholder model is what we are doing, and the rest it's just details. Thank you.
Thank you. Virat, please.
Thank you, Marcus. I'll try and attempt 2 or 3 points that were made. First, the issue of equal footing. I'm going to draw one example here, which is the point that was made first off, which is the government's responsibility to build infrastructure, and just illustrate how equal footing would work in that one case. It would begin ideally with the government realizing that this is one area where private sector investment can be brought in, and that the government funds should be diverted to areas where private sector funding would not be available, such as primary education, rural health, rural infrastructure, roads, and other areas which don't make for a good business case and will not allow for private investment. Once that realization comes into the policy and the fact there is shortage of government funding available, then you would be expected to write policies that would allow for private investment with an appropriate level of foreign direct investment, whatever is suitable for that country. That would then be followed by writing actual legislation, laws, whatever is required to provide investor confidence and an environment in which investors can make that investment. Once such steps have been taken, then it would become, the scene would shift to the private sector, who would bring in the capital, who would bring in the infrastructure, who would start putting out the switches, the fiber, start the spectrum, and the process would begin. The government would be required to build up a, let's say, a independent regulator, so that such capacity would be available, and you could start removing some of the important functions out of government, which would be traditionally an operator in the telecom sector. At this time, the civil society would have an important role, because they would determine and help the government with which are the areas that are underserved. Are there business cases that are not working in broadband connectivity for rural parts of a specific country? What kind of programs can be rolled out on education, on e-health, on basic grassroots level empowerment using the infrastructure that the private sector hopefully builds out. The technical communities would come in with their role, which is how can we stretch the spectrum to the maximum? What are the new innovations that are possible on sides of technology that will help empower people, women, the underprivileged? This will also have a role for the academia, a very important role, which is in many cases lead committees which will have these discussions, write out papers which would project what the future of the investment should be, put out case studies of what worked and what didn't work in the past, do research across the world and provide information in the infrastructure building process of what's happened. So I'm just, we can go on and on, but you can see that each of the multi-stakeholder participants that has been identified under the Tunis agenda actually has a role in equal footing under just one piece, which is building infrastructure. You could then take this to the 4 other pieces that were mentioned, legal framework, defending free speech, etc., and we can go on. But I think the youth, for example, you would think, what would they do? So they are the consumers of tomorrow. They are telling you what kind of services they need, what kind of educational and knowledge-related capacity is required in that network to stretch the network to help meet the needs of the 21st century. So this is just one example of equal footing as we see it from the private sector. It doesn't stop the role from the government from beginning to the end. It doesn't stop the roles from the private sector from the beginning or the end. And all the roles keep evolving, but everybody does what they are supposed to do to bring this infrastructure puzzle built out. Let's remind ourselves that 2.7 billion people across the world, or approximately 40% of the world population, is online today. Only 16% of the Asian population, that continent that we are currently in and hold this IGF at, is online. So there's a long way to go. On where we go from here, that's what our objectives are, that's what our sort of plans would have to be. I also want to bring in a little bit about what the governments can do to strengthen the multi-stakeholder processes. I'll refer India here. I think there are fellowships being offered to, I'm not sure what the numbers are, for young people to travel to events like this. I think it's 2 international events and 2 domestic events related to internet governance. I can be corrected. There are several people who are involved with that. So they are instituting fellowships based on government and private sector funding that are sitting there to expose more people to this entire dialogue that is currently on. I think it's an excellent program. People have traveled on that program to this IGF and will to the future IGFs. Then there are areas of new technology. For example, the one piece that we haven't built a lot on is mobile internet so far as a discussion, or M2M, which is a huge area of discussion and build up. So I think that's something that the governments are now opening up. I'll just close by saying that for 2014 and 15 are crucial years. Let's just keep our hearts and minds open. Let's not decide too early on which way to go. I think this will evolve if we lend ourselves to this open consultative process of this kind and all the other meetings that have been mentioned that will occur during 2014. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Thank you, sir. I don't want to take up too much time so that we can return to the audience and our colleagues can finish speaking. I want to make one point, however, about the WSIS process. We are now looking at a WSIS plus 10 review. The CSTD is in the process of conducting a holistic review of seeing where the action lines, where we are relative to the action lines as an international community. And I think two things need to happen. One, we need to finish that review. We need to assess if there's further work that needs to be done on the existing action lines, and then we need to assess how we can move forward to ensure that we achieve the completion of those tasks that have already been set before us. I think it would be both premature in the sense that the 10 years have not been completed, neither has the review, to talk about either conducting some sort of new WSIS or instituting some sort of new action lines. We're not yet, that is not a discussion that is ripe in our minds. But again, if there are others with different points of view, we would welcome hearing those. But we will be having that discussion over the next year.
There will also be the question of the extension of the IGF mandate, and I hope the mandate will be extended, because I feel we do need this kind of platform. Shall we go to the end of the table? Ambassador Fonseca.
Thank you. I would, as a final comment, reiterate that Brazil sees the multi-stakeholder model and IGF, which is maybe the best expression of the multi-stakeholder model at the international arena, as a very important place that serves as a meeting point for ideas, for contacts among different stakeholders, and for cross-fertilization of ideas and efforts. We are convinced that the quality of decisions and the legitimacy of initiatives is further reinforced to the extent that stakeholders engage, government, civil society, private sectors, all the stakeholders as recognized by the Tunis Agenda. So we value the multi-stakeholder format, IGF, and indeed Brazil has put forward its candidacy to host IGF in 2015. I was thinking that I would like to propose an acronym for this exercise, and I would suggest ICT, in which I would stand for information. It's important, and it has been highlighted by some parties, the importance that each stakeholder, each group of stakeholders will be appraised of what others are doing, and this is maybe a starting point for the second letter of the acronym, which is C, that is for cooperation, to identify opportunities for cooperation and to make sure that all the concerns are addressed within this context. And the final letter would stand for trust. This exercise can only hold if there is trust, if there is mutual recognition and mutual acceptance of stakeholders. On the part of governments, on the part of other stakeholders, it implies a change in cultures. We must recognize there are different cultures. Government usually manage things in a certain way. Civil society has also a way of dealing. So we are talking about a collective endeavor. So it requires new ways of thinking, new creative ways of thinking. And in that sense, this session that focuses on the role of governments, and we are very pleased to be part of the discussion. We think we had a very high-level discussion. And from the perspective of government, it is sometimes even strange to see people say, oh, we don't think there is any role, but I'm glad to see that this is evolving, and it was acknowledged by participants even from the panel. Since from the point of view of government, some roles have a clear demand for government action. I would give two examples. In Brazil, we have, as you know, an area that accounts for roughly half of the country in the Amazon. So it requires clearly government in cooperation with other stakeholders, but it requires policy to be to address the situation in which we can make sure that the Amazon is connected, that remote communities are connected. This is something that will not be dealt with uniquely by the private sector or the civil society. So the government has a clear role in that. And if we can also think in areas like defense, it's also a clear area for government in regard to cybersecurity. So I think the beauty of the exercise is this, to identify areas in which working the multi-stakeholder model, the mix and the intensity of cooperation will differ. And this should be acknowledged by government, but also acknowledged by the other parties. I would also briefly refer to the summit that will be held in Brazil, and I want also to take note of the concern of other parties in regard on how this would relate to existing processes, and I just want to make clear that Brazil is respectful of the existing processes. Actually, we have been active participants in all those processes, and we certainly would not like our event in Brazil to compete or to overlap with any of these important meetings taking place. The Sharm el-Sheikh meeting, of course, is a very important process. The CSTD meeting that will receive the report from the Working Group on Enhanced Cooperation is also a very important process. So we think this should be, as we plan for our event, we'll make sure this will not be touched upon. But referring to all these processes, in our view, there is a clear need for a high-level review event, standalone event, either in 2015 or late 2014, to collect all those inputs that are being generated. The Sharm el-Sheikh meeting will produce some very interesting outputs, as Ambassador Sepúlveda was saying, but also the Working Group on Enhanced Cooperation. We expect it also to produce some very important ideas. We have been discussing on the meaning of equal footing, what are the areas that government should engage into this. So I think the enhanced cooperation will wishfully provide some ideas on how to proceed in that. And this will take place later on. Our meeting will take place later on, and there are many important inputs being produced. So we clearly see the need for a high-level, multi-stakeholder event that will collect those inputs and make some decisions. We are not envisioning to reinterpret it or to redraft the Tunis agenda. We don't think this is a good way or wise way to proceed, but we think that adjustments or some decisions taken by an authoritative body, multi-stakeholder body, might be necessary as a result of this. I think it would be a pity if we lose the opportunity as we complete 10 years of the Tunis summit not to engage in an in-depth exercise that would go beyond a more bureaucratic review of action lines. So this is the position we are taking this. And finally, just to thank you and our partners, my colleagues in the table for a very high-level discussion, for very active participation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Weise.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I had the first word, and now you've given me the last word. We have 3 minutes left to this session, so I will be brief. Yes, I think the IGF needs to raise its presence. The speaker from the floor who started off the last round of questions made, I think, a very valid point that a lot of countries do have a sort of default position of thinking about the ITU. The ITU has been around a lot longer than the IGF, so it's important that we think about how we promote the IGF's activities around the world, and that's something that the UK government wants to participate in, and it's very important. And it's also, I think, important that at the end of IGF summits, not necessarily policy proposals, but some sense of the mood, consensus, the themes emerges that people can take away from the IGF. So I think there is work to be done there. But we supported some of the changes to this year's IGF which have made it the best ever. So it continues to evolve and continues to play, obviously, an absolutely vital role in internet governance discussions. I very much support what Nigel Hickson said about the globalization of IT, which is why I very much hope that everyone will be at the Indian government's reception on Thursday at 11 o'clock to hear about their experiences, because that is the next great challenge, to absorb the next billion or 2 billion who are going to come online and change the internet once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I would like to thank all the panelists. As one speaker from the floor said, we had an excellent discussion that heralds a significant tomorrow. I think we really reached large areas of convergence in our discussions, and I take a very strong notion of partnership among all stakeholders, of trust and partnership, and clearly also convergence that we do need to increase the meaningful participation of developing countries in all the internet governance arrangements. I think we also had a first. I think it's the first time, if not mistaken, that the minister participates in a panel for 3 hours and actively engages. I know it's the nightmare usually of civil servants. They fear ministers don't have a script ahead. So thank you very much for this, for your active participation.
My civil servants know my concentration levels. So they were worried I wouldn't last the 3 hours. But it was such an interesting discussion that I decided to stay.
Thank you very much for this. I would also like to thank our remote moderator and our floor moderators, Matthew Shears and Janet Hoffman, and like to join me in giving a hand to all the panelists. It was really a good panel. The meeting is adjourned, and we'll be all here this afternoon, 2:30, for the opening ceremony and the opening session. Thank you.
Of course. We will always